Hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off now. Well, all right. It just turned to 12:10 on my watch, so I don't actually have a watch on my phone. So welcome, everybody, for joining us for the third and last session of the Invasive Species Lunchtime Talks. This is a program brought to you from University of California Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources as part of California Invasive Species Action Week. Many thanks to California Department of Fish and Wildlife for heading up the overall week. And after this webinar coming up this weekend, if you go to the California Invasive Species Action Week website, you can find a bunch of more hands-on things to do this weekend. So look forward to that. If you are joining us as an attendee, you don't have the ability to come in on the audio. So please communicate with us through the chat box, and we'd appreciate knowing if you are in a room with multiple participants. That's great for us to know. Let us know also where you are joining from. And if you are with, say, an agency or organization, let us know that too. So this, today we're focusing on invasive plants and fire in California. I will be your chair. I'm Sabrina Drill. I'm the Natural Resources Advisor for Los Angeles and Ventura Counties with UC Cooperative Extension and the Associate Director of the California Naturalist Program. Our two additional presenters today who are actually going to present first, and then I'll come in last with a presentation, are Matthew Brooks from the USGS Western Ecological Research Center and Katie Van Zant from the U.S. Forest Service. I told Matt that I was just going to start off with a definition. I always like to define this for folks who are working in invasive species, just to be clear that invasive species are organisms. They can be plants, animals, pathogens, fungi, bacteria, whatever, who are non-native to an ecosystem and by definition whose introduction causes harm. So it's not all exotic species, it's just a subset. They tend to be things that like disturbance and that reproduce quickly and at high levels. They cost a lot of money to manage. The last good estimate I could find was $120 billion in the US in 2005. I'm sure it's up from that since then. And they affect just a little under half of our threatened and endangered species around the world. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Matt Brooks to talk a little bit about his research in this area.
All right. Probably helpful if I unmuted.
Probably.
Well, thank you for the invitation. My name is Matt Brooks. My background is mostly in fire and invasive species research and management applications in the North American deserts and also in California ecosystems. What Sabrina asked me to talk about is some general background about how non-native species can alter wildfire regimes. And I want to give examples, talk specifically about bromus species or brome grasses in the Western US. So first of all, it's important to understand that a fire regime includes a lot of different components. It's not just fire isn't a binary thing on the landscape. It has temporal, spatial, and magnitude aspects that over time are real strong evolutionary factors in the evolution of species. And non-native species in various ways can alter these regimes and potentially threaten native species by changing their disturbance regime. So without non-native species, you basically have fuels, topography, and climate, and the fuels are all native species. And fuels, topography, and climate are a sort of fire triangle that affects the fire regime and creates the conditions that promote a particular aspect of fire regime. When you have non-native species, the fuel bed is comprised of various combinations of natives and non-natives. And if those non-native species are adding a novel fuel type, maybe making the fuel bed finer, kind of more like kindling and easier to ignite, it could be the opposite. It could make the fuel bed maybe more coarse and harder to ignite. But in all these different ways, they change fuel beds and they can affect fire regimes. Now, when you get a situation where the changes in the fire regimes tend to promote the non-native species over the native species, the fuel beds change over time, and the plant communities change over time, and you can get complete formation changes, for example, from forests to grasslands, potentially, over time. And when that happens, you get a positive feedback situation that's referred to as the non-native plant fire regime cycle. One of the best examples of it is the grass fire cycle, which is probably maybe what you're more familiar with. And one of the poster children in that is cheatgrass in the Great Basin, basically creating more continuous fuels in between, in this case, sagebrush, that provides continuity of fuels and allows fires to spread more readily, so that when you get ignitions, you get complete burns, and then you get condition where you get reignitions and recurrent fire, and such that the native sagebrush species can't live within this new fire regime of short fire return intervals, and you get a type conversion from a native sage steppe community to a non-native annual grass community. Although this is the most well described and published example, there's lots of others too. Here's how you might break down this grass fire cycle in the case of cheatgrass. In this case, annual grasses like cheatgrass. Over time, this is how they change the fuel load. You can reduce coarse fuels by replacing woody shrubs with grasses. You increase the fine fuel load, the amount. You increase the continuity. You increase the ignitability. And the changes that it causes in fire regimes is increasing the seasonal window. So you have longer fire seasons during the summer. The individual fires are larger, and the frequency of fires are larger. These conditions of the fire regime are not conducive to reestablishment of the native species, but the non-native grasses are well adapted for them. So I want to switch and talk a bit about aspects of fire that actually promote this feedback to increase dominance by invasives. So said another way, how do fire promote the dominance of non-natives versus natives? So one thing that fires do is they can increase light levels, and that can promote plant invasions. Removing vegetation by any means can increase the probability of plant invasions. And in particular, one of the things it does is it increases light levels. So basically, this is really important where native cover is naturally high. For example, forested systems, closed canopy forests, tend to be difficult for especially herbaceous species to invade on the forest floor because there's so much shading. And also it occurs where non-native species don't regrow real quickly. Especially it happens when you have high severity fires in forests that remove the canopy and the canopy doesn't replace itself. This is an example of that. This is the Star Fire in Tahoe National Forest from 2001. This is a picture 6 years after an area that burned at high severity. Completely removed the conifer forest. You do see some conifer seedlings coming back, but for the most part, this is going to be a landscape that's going to be, at the very most, a long time for the forest to recover. And in the meantime, this is cheatgrass. It's set up to burn again in short measure. And if you get fires that occur when these seedlings are still at this stage, they won't survive. Coupled with this, too, of course, is the environmental conditions that promote forest reestablishment. And that can be affected by warming summers, warming climates, longer summers. So there is an interaction with climate change as well. But this is an example from a forested system. Now, fires also increase soil nutrient levels. This is really important and has this greatest effect where nutrient levels are naturally low, for example, in deserts. So one of the ways that, deserts have plenty of light, so they're really not light limited for invasions, but the soil nutrient levels are generally low. And so when you get combustion of the organic material, usually at low enough severities where it doesn't actually volatilized and is lost from the system up into the atmosphere. It just deposits as ash, and you get a change from this distribution of the nutrients underneath creosote bushes, like in this example, to interspaces. And this is a 10-year post-fire landscape in the central Mojave Desert, and this is red brome or Bromus rubens in the interspaces. This landscape here burns naturally at a 100+ year fire return interval. This is 10 years after the fire, and this landscape can carry fire again as it stands in this example. It's important to understand too, fire management activities, though often important in managing fire, and actually important in managing non-native species too, also can have some other effects on plant invasions. There's a little bit of research that indicates phosphate-based fire retardants can fertilize, especially desert systems. Not a whole lot of research on it, but I've seen lots of examples of it actually post-fire in the Mojave, where you can still see the red retardant drops, and the dominance of red brome is significantly higher on those drops. This is probably a transient effect, but it's important to understand that it is an effect. Fuel treatments that remove vegetation, just like fire, can also promote invasions. This is an example from the Colorado Plateau of a fuel treatment in a PJ sagebrush, bitterbrush ecotone. Some pretty good research done in California by John Keeley and others on how fuel breaks can promote movement of non-native species into landscapes. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that in and of themselves they're a net negative thing in terms of invasive species management, because you have to weigh the benefit of the fuel breaks in terms of managing fire, which may otherwise, depending on the context, be a bigger invasive species problem in terms of removing non-resilient native vegetation. So one of the things that's important to understand is that a lot of times non-native, this grass fire cycle or whatever, is cited as a problem for plant invasions. It's actually kind of difficult to document that it actually is established and is happening. Basically, you need to consider that the plant invasions has altered fuel beds, the fuel bed changes alter fire regimes, and the new fire regimes promote the dominance of the fuels that drive it. Interestingly enough, there's relatively few studies that explicitly evaluate and document these three steps. So really, it's just a thing I like to mention, that if you're really scrutinizing the threat of a non-native species to altering a fire regime, you have to really ask these three questions in pretty good rigor. Brome grasses are among the most notorious non-native species altering fire regimes. This is ripgut brome, Bromus diandris, and there's some cheatgrass in there too in Zion Canyon. There's a number of Bromus species across the West. The main ones in California are Madrotensis rubens and diandris, tectorum at higher elevations. This next slide shows by ecoregion. Mediterranean California is the most diverse in terms of the number of species: red brome, ripgut brome, smooth brome, Madrotensis, Mediterranean brome, and downy brome or cheatgrass. Here's an example of some of them. This is diandris and tectorum next to each other. This is rubens in the Mojave. This is an interesting picture, and I'll just mention that it provides one cautionary tale. That is that experimentally evaluated the effect of imazapic, an herbicide, on controlling Bromus diandris in this riparian environment, and Bromus tectorum replaced it. This is 2 years after this treatment. So one sort of rule of thumb, obviously, if you're going to remove one invasive, you need to make sure you understand what might replace it. And in this case, in terms of managing fires, you've really not bought yourself anything in terms of reducing the fire hazard by controlling ripgut brome in this situation. Resistance and resilience are really important to consider as I start to wrap up this talk. Resistance to Bromus invasion and resilience to native vegetation to fire are key concepts. Basically, if the resistance is high to Bromus invasion, it's going to be difficult for a grass fire cycle to get established with Bromus. Generally speaking, warmer, drier conditions have lower resistance, and Bromus invades more readily, sort of desert systems. Cooler, wetter forest has higher resistance to Bromus. Resilience is the other part of the equation. How readily do native vegetation recover following fire? If you have native vegetation that recovers, especially by resprouting, reestablishes cover very quickly within a couple years, you're going to have, that's a very high resilient native vegetation. The chance of a grass fire cycle are very slim. If on the other hand, the native vegetation doesn't recover very quickly, you're more likely to have that potential once the grass invasions promote initial fires. An example of extremely low resilience of blackbrush and increased soil nutrients following fire facilitates the conversion of things like, this is native blackbrush in southwest Utah, invaded blackbrush with cheatgrass and red brome after one fire. This is nearby after multiple fires, what the landscape looks like. Even after a single fire, this is a picture 7 years post-fire in 1946 in Lincoln County area of southern Nevada. This area previously looked like this. This would have been an example of what it would look like. 63 years later, without a subsequent fire, it still looks like this. This is red brome. The red brome is still there. So even after a single fire, these changes from these native vegetations following fire and competition of seedlings of blackbrush to get reestablished with the bromus species, even if you don't have another fire, those landscapes can stay altered for a very long time. An example of really high resilience mixed conifer, normally this is 2 years post-fire. These are some experimental fires done in Kings Canyon, specifically evaluating effective fire on cheatgrass. Needle cast, you can see some of the needle cast as much as occurs during just 2 years, some shading. The cheatgrass really hasn't established. As I mentioned before in the star fire, if you don't have that cover with the needle cast, the cheatgrass can reestablish very quickly. So there's a big difference in the context. Even in a forested system that you might think is resilient to fire, if you get a fire out of context, like a high severity crown fire, it can change the landscape, and the relationship between fire and invasive species is an important factor in changing that landscape. So in conclusion on my part of this talk, I just want to mention 2 publications. I sent these to Sabrina. I think she may have shared them somehow with you. If not, you can always contact me to get them. There's one handbook here created for fire managers, specifically Fish and Wildlife Service, but there contains very general guidelines on managing invasive species in the context of fire management. And lastly, there's this general technical report. I gave Sabrina a PDF of 1 chapter from it that is related to how invasives change fire regimes. The whole GTR, though, is full of, I don't know, there's maybe 27 chapters in here. This is a really good resource, probably the best single resource for understanding non-native species management in the context of fire. And I could provide more information about how to get the entire GTR as well if you email me. Thank you.
Matt, thank you so much. I did not actually post the PDFs that you sent me yet. I was trying to look if I could do that via links instead of reposting the whole article. Mm-hmm. But I did just post a link to your whole list of publications on your USGS.
And you can always also provide my email information, my email address, and people can always contact me.
Great. I will add that to the website too. And I'll look for links to both of those documents that I can add directly there. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, Katie, are you ready to go?
Yes, let me share my screen here.
Great, and while she's getting that set up, Katie Van Zandt is a botanist with the U.S. Forest Service. She's going to talk a little bit more, as you can see the title, about controlling invasive plants after fire.
Okay, Sabrina, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what the Forest Service, at least what the Angeles National Forest does after fires. And we certainly have our fair share of fires. Seems like every year we have, I think the stats come in around 300 to 500 starts per year on the forest. Luckily, only a few of those become really large, over a couple hundred acres, but we seem to have one of those every year as well. So mostly I'm going to talk about The station fire, which was our last really large fire, it was 160,000 acres. That was roughly a quarter of the forest that burned. And what we did post that fire. But we also do this applies to pretty much all of our large-scale fires. So this is kind of the picture of the landscape that a lot of times we walk out after the fire, and this is what we're going to see. It's kind of a lot of a blank slate, particularly in this location. This is a pretty much moderate to high burn severity fire. And this is what sometimes happens, just like Matt was talking about for type conversion. This is certainly an area that has gone from chaparral, mixed chaparral vegetation going to non-native annual grassland mixed with a bunch of mustard and other not so fun things. We also see fields of shrubs like Spanish broom, so things forming monocultures in these areas. So, you know, it can be somewhat daunting walking out and seeing that blackened landscape. And we start thinking about, well, why, you know, how are we going to tackle these weeds, and why are we going to start doing any sort of management on them? And that's because of all the wildlife and plant life species that we have. On the Angeles, we have roughly 2,500 different plant species known. On the forest, we have a bunch of rare species, things that are endemic only to the Angeles or to the transverse ranges. And that's why we want to get a handle, if we can, on the weed species, predominantly the high priority species. So what is the strategy, the game plan that we come up with? Because we only get pretty limited funding post-fire, we have to certainly prioritize. And the first area that we look at are riparian areas. And that's really because riparian areas are the lifeblood of the forest. That's so important for wildlife, for habitat. Not only that, but it's also a drinking source, a water source for, you know, the 14, 15 million people of Los Angeles. And we certainly have an impact on the availability of water. So this is our number one priority. It's also riparian areas are also a really good vector for spreading invasives. So we definitely want to take a look at those areas. DOZERLINES, suppression activity in general. This DOZERLINE is roughly 500 to 700 feet wide. And you can see all the mechanical work that's been done. That certainly is a good avenue for spreading invasives around. So that's our second priority, is to go to those areas that were heavily disturbed post-fire. It's not so much what burned, it's really where they put heavy equipment, which is very frequent on Angeles. Typically for a fire, we can get anywhere from 10 miles of DOZERLINE to, on the station fire, we had 150 miles of DOZERLINE that we needed to deal with. Roads, that's our third priority. Those are really good vectors as well. And also suppression equipment coming through onto the forest. This is a good place for them to drop seeds off. We have equipment coming from all over the U.S., which oftentimes we try to set up weed washing stations, but a lot of times it is not cleaned prior to going out and performing suppression activities. So we definitely want to be taking a look at our roads, Forest Service roads, dirt roads especially. Fourth, we try to take a look at trails if we can. A lot of times there is not funding to do that, but obviously trails can be good little vector highways for spreading invasives as well. So those are our kind of top priority areas to be looking. Then we have the hit list of all the different invasive plants that we know are currently on the Angeles, and that's over 100 different species. We have roughly at this point about 40 to high priority invasive species that we can really go after. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. So this is just a longer list of some of the baddies that we really go after. And it's really from Calypsi, we are going after ones that are listed as severe or moderate. And we do deal with some limited ones that are maybe limited across the state, but are less common on the Angeles. We will actually go after some of those as well. So here's tamarisk, that's a number one priority for us. Spanish broom, fennel, and whoops, I skipped a page. Oh, no, okay. So yeah, we have a long list. That's the take-home message. There's a huge list of things to be surveying for. Well, who do we get to do this work? And that's seasonal crews. We also, at this point, because of issues we have with the federal government with hiring, we also have a partnership agreement with Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden, and they pretty much hire all of our weed crew members at this time. So this crew started back in 2009, and based off soft money alone, we've kept that crew going to the present year-round. So that's a partnership that we have built up with Rancho. So how do we do this work? Mission priorities and people that we get, but it's basically just going out and hitting the ground, surveying here. We GPS everything. We take a lot of attribute information about, the species, obviously, the number of individuals, and if it was treated or not. And then most of the work is spent pulling. And we try to get to things before they have set seed, before they have viable reproductive parts, so that we can minimize the amount of bagging that we need to do. So back in the day when the station fire was happening, back in the early 2000s, we were using a lot of hand methods, just using our hands, and some pretty low-tech tools like this weed wrench. But since then, we have been able to get environmental documentation, NEPA, done to use herbicides across the forest, and that is a major tool for us at this point. We've had a major shift away from hand removal, although we still do a lot of that, to also having another tool of herbicides. And we have a list of about 5 different herbicides that we can use, which has been really helpful. I mentioned partnership agreements, but we also really rely on our fire crews to help us, them removing Spanish broom off the roadside, and volunteers. That can be a tough thing, trying to get volunteers involved, especially when it's rough work, like Spanish broom in the middle of nowhere. It takes an hour and a half to drive to this location. So it can be challenging to get volunteers involved. But you definitely get some diehard people that are interested, and that's kind of how we have sustained the program. And so I just want to give you kind of a visual here of the work that was done. So this was for the station fire. This is everything that we surveyed in purple for 160,000 acres. Then here's what we mapped 1 year post-fire for tamarisk. And then hopefully this works, but you'll see this shrinking of the population as we treat it. So 3 years post-fire, you can see in this very detailed graph here, we had a major reduction over 3 years in the amount of tamarisk that we were finding. So it was very heartening to see this trend as we went, that we were making a difference, and we were seeing the native vegetation come in and shade out tamarisk in this scenario. We also saw the same for Spanish broom. So we tracked a couple species, but this was one of the more dramatic ones. And that's all I have.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Katie. Hey, I loved that low-tech graph there. Seeing the tamarisk gone is fantastic. Okay, I'm going to, not seeing any sort of direct questions for you here, I'm going to go ahead and grab that screen back, and okay. I'm going to focus a little bit on a slightly different context here. After some of the fires in 2007, primarily in Southern California, we started on a program called Sustainable and Fire Safe, I guess the E is capitalized there, landscapes, to really look at how we could look near home and improve both fire safety and preparedness in wildland-urban interface areas, on small lots, really, people's backyards, to protect life and property, but also how we could do that in a way that could safeguard the health of neighboring habitat areas, because most of these, well, all of these wildland-urban interface areas back right up to natural, and if you could see me, I'm doing air quotes there, natural habitat, because of course there are all kinds of other impacts going on too. So just a few things about fire-resistant landscapes and invasive plants specifically. So one of the issues that we were trying to address is the fact that invasive plants can escape from fire-safe landscapes. So we actually had situations where fire departments, nurseries, various other groups might be recommending a specific suite of plants that they considered to be fire resistant, but that might include invasive species. And so part of this project was really working with those various groups, reviewing all the plant lists that we could get a hold of, and contacting the authors and distributors of those lists to talk to them about invasive species and get invasive species removed. I think our biggest sort of get for that part, we worked closely with the fire departments in LA and Ventura, and I think made a lot of improvements. But we also worked with Lowe's and got them to change some of their recommendations. So that was really great. The other piece of this is that over clearance for fire safety, when people go out into that zone that's 100 or 200 feet or even further from their backyard and clear things down to bare earth, that can promote the spread of invasive plants by creating disturbed areas where especially annual grasses can really take hold. And then, as Katie and Matt mentioned a little bit, disturbance during firefighting. So when vehicles are brought in to establish those dozer lines, that kind of thing. And in post-fire landscape management, there can be activities that promote invasive plants. So just a few things about fire-safe landscapes, regardless of the invasive plant kind of issue. Fire-safe landscapes really are about looking at things in terms of different zones where you can take action to reduce the chance that fire will spread from an active burn area up to homes themselves. And one of the really important pieces of this, before I start talking a little bit about defensible space, is to make sure that if you are looking at how to improve fire safety in wildland-urban interface areas, you start with the structure. You don't immediately go to the landscape and pulling out plants. You think about the structure itself and how you can harden those structures to be more resistant to fire. Also to realize that usually what we're talking about are wind-driven wildfires that result in essentially ember storms. So we're not talking about fires that are creeping along the ground or in the grounds and directly bringing flames up to houses. It's usually thinking about how we can reduce the risk of embers landing near a home and igniting that structure. So we think about the defensible space area. Usually that's referring to an area that's about 100 feet around the structure where we can reduce the chance of ignition and fire spread, but also, and this is really important, a lot of it's about providing a safe place for firefighters to work. Near the home, very near the home, in the first 5 feet from the home, we'd recommend not having any flammable materials, be that plant materials or woody mulches, or even thinking about furniture and firewood stacks and those kinds of things, moving those away from the home. In the next 30 feet, thinking about sort of lean, clean, and green is the buzzword there. So having some shrubs, maybe some, vegetable beds, some flower beds, that kind of thing close to, can be planted near the home. But what you're really trying to do is separate things either vertically or horizontally to make sure that there aren't fuel ladders, because a ground fire is less likely to pose a real threat to structures than this high ember producing crown fire. In the next 30 feet, again, continue eliminating fuel ladders. You can have some trees there They should be spaced and well maintained. Going further than that, there's no evidence that that's going to offer really additional protection. That depends a little bit on the slope condition where you're working, but essentially in these ember-driven fires, embers are moving embers are moving miles, and so going further isn't really going to provide an additional benefit, but it does provide more risk to habitat. In terms of landscape plant choice in those planted, sort of maintained areas, realize that any plant will burn under the right conditions, that fire-resistant plants for Southern California are drought tolerant. And so when you think about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but essentially you want things that are going to maintain a high vegetation content, even with limited watering, because there's not going to be a lot of water available. So it's not a lush, tropical look. It's things that are going to achieve both of those goals, reducing water use and providing some fire resistance. But that means you really got to watch out for Mediterranean invasive plants. So most of the invasive plants that are posing a threat in Southern California are those that don't need supplemental water. They're adapted to dry climate conditions, and that's why they can do well in natural habitat areas of Southern California. So be really careful with drought-tolerant plants. And you can absolutely produce a fire-resistant landscape using all native plants. There's a few native species to avoid, so I'm not saying that all native plants are a good choice for a fire-resistant landscape, but there are plenty of native plants that are good choices. When we think about highly flammable plants, it's things that produce a lot of dead material and a lot of litter and are really hard to maintain, and then also perhaps of volatile substances. So there are some native plants that I would avoid especially in the first 30 feet near a home in the wildland-urban interface, like buckwheat, chamise, red shanks, which produces a lot of litter. But it's a lot of the invasive plants that we've seen really seem to be increasing the risk to structures, and especially, boy, those Italian cypresses that people like to plant right up under their eaves. Not a great idea. When you think about fire-resistant plants, it's these plants that do well with limited watering. If they're slow growing and don't produce a lot of dead material, that's great. And so one of the issues that we came up against a lot in fire plant lists was the use of ice plant. Some species of ice plant, especially what they call roadside ice plant or Hottentot fig, Carpobrotus edulis, are a particular problem. And one of the things that ice plant and things like vinca and ivies do is they provide perhaps what looks like a nice green cover, but underneath they're harboring dead material that can actually harbor hotspots in a fire situation. So again, things that are open where you can see all of the vegetation and you can cut back and maintain the dry stuff is what you want. And then things that aren't producing a lot of oils are good to avoid. So these are some fire-resistant native plants that you can use, but still use in sort of appropriate clumpings with fuel break areas, whether that's grass or gravel mulches or other non-combustible materials in between. And there's some great California native trees that are fabulous alternatives to things like eucalyptus and pines and the cypresses that people tend to use a lot as well. When it comes to brush clearance, so this is where I say conduct reasonable fire hazard reduction. Brush clearance is a pretty misleading term because generally the goal isn't clearing everything away. And brush has taken on sort of a negative meaning, and that sort of it sounds like when we're talking about brush, we're sort of labeling our native vegetation as something that's bad or hazardous. A big idea here, and this is what these graphics are supposed to be, is no moonscape and no donut holes. So in the middle picture there, if you could see, there's actually a house inside all of those pine trees. So they went out and cleared, quote unquote, cleared the brush, several, maybe 100, 150 feet away from the structure, but didn't do anything near the structure to get rid of those high fire risk plants. And again, those areas are prone to weedy invasive plants coming in. And what can happen is people clear these areas by a brush clearance deadline in May or June, just leave this disturbed ground without any vegetation on it. Annual grasses come in, produce these fine fuel loads that Matt talked about earlier, and then by the time it gets windy in September, October, and fire season really kicks off, although it seems to be year-round here lately, you just have this sea of weeds that can really provide a continuous fuel bed for a ground fire. So these are some good resources you can find on my website, which I'll show at the end, the Safe Landscapes website, and I'll add that link to, actually that link is in the top menu of the invasive species lunchtime talks. But these are some great alternatives to look for what to avoid and what you can use instead for different kinds of landscape elements. I just wanted to talk briefly about post-fire recovery issues. So, and I'm up here in Ventura, so we, recently experienced and are still dealing with our first year post largest wildfire in the state's history, the Thomas Fire. So post-fire in most natural habitat areas, there's very little that needs to be done. Natural recovery and doing nothing may be best, although it's really difficult for people to do that a lot of times. Many of the native woody shrubs and oaks will resprout from root crowns. There's annual and perennial shrubs that you may only see after a fire. These are our fire follower native flowers that need exposure to smoke or heat actually to grow. And then what may be most important, and this is kind of what Katie talked about, is controlling those invasive weeds to allow the natives to recover naturally. So issues, when you think about post-fire land management, the issues are really, you may, if you have a natural fire adapted regime, you may just see natural recovery of vegetation. But if you're in this fire invasive species cycle, you may need to take some action. You do have to deal with issues like air pollution and nutrient loading and the loss of connectivity and perhaps loss of a seed bed if an area has been disturbed. The other challenge with doing nothing is a socio-political pressure to do something. It's important, though, in planning activities to really think about intervening only where it's vital to protect assets like homes and other structures and specific valuable cultural resources. When you think about erosion treatments, choosing the best erosion treatment will really have to do with the burn severity, the slope, and the proximity, and also how much money and effort you can put into this. And you need to think about the short and the long-term goals. And all of this is sort of build up to talk more specifically about one type of post-fire alternative, which may have its place, but was perhaps over-applied in the past, and that's seeding. So seeding can be something you might want to do for slip stabilization, reducing runoff, perhaps restoring ecosystems, although it's very rarely needed for that. And it can actually be used to control invasive species to kind of tip the scales towards the native seed that you're applying. It used to be done a lot with exotic annuals. We're moving away from that now. There is some use of exotic sterile hybrids. Ideally, though, seeding is being done where it might be useful with a mix of native annuals and perennials, and ideally a hyper-local mix to that area that burned. And of course, there are areas where it may be appropriate to replant trees in more forested areas. But when we think about to seed or not to seed, a couple of things to factor in. It's expensive, especially if it's hydroseed plus mulch. The native seed supplies, especially those hyper-local seeds, may be limited if there hasn't already been a nursery established pre-fire. The timing is critical. If you're seeding right before the rainy season, it may just be a waste of time because most of that seed will wash away. At best, it produces effective cover of 30 to 50% of the time, and it can lead to increased pine fuels for the following fire season. A little alliteration there. To be effective, usually it needs to be protected from grazing, which can be difficult. In fact, there's some cases where they know that, there's some studies where they found that seeding attracted vertebrate pests, reed gophers and ground squirrels. And instead, in the end, instead of providing protection from erosion, because it attracted those species, there was actually greater destabilization of slopes. And generally, it has the potential to inhibit the medium to long-term recovery of the vegetation that was local to that area, because you're competing with the native seed bank. So just a few pictures of sort of what we're talking about with natural fire recovery. This is from the Thomas Fire burn area here in Ventura. And this is a few months later, and you can see we've got a mix of natives and invasives coming up. And so this is an area where it may make sense to go in and do some more active invasive species control, but certainly no need for reseeding. This is in the park just behind the city of Ventura, Arroyo Verde. And these are just a few pretty pictures of some of the fire followers that I haven't seen in the Thomas Fire burn area, but have been seen around the state after other fires. And with that, I am done with my presentation formally. Greg, are you on now? Oh.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, the
thanks.
poll has been launched, and if anyone has any questions they want to enter through the chat or through the question and answer tab, we can take those as well. We don't currently have any questions online, though.
Okay. And we appreciate you taking this brief poll here. We just want to see whether you learned something today, and a little bit about whether you might be likely to take any action since then.
Sabrina, there's one question that came in that asking as to whether or not the previous webinars have been recorded and are available or will be.
Yes. So we're recording all of these webinars. It's going to take a little bit of processing time, and then those will make links available to those webinars on the webpage that you found us through, the Invasive Species Lunchtime Talks. Let's see, any specific questions for Matt and Katie? Give people just a few minutes. We did have one question that I'll pose if any of the other presenters wanted to chime in. Somebody had asked previously whether we had any information about eucalyptus, and I guess any, if anybody had heard anything specific, I guess, about the role of eucalyptus in perhaps the Santa Rosa area fires in Northern California.
And Sabrina, we have another question in the question and answer tab. Are the broom mites in El Dorado County arriving in other counties with broom problems? And I'm not sure who that's directed to, but it'll open it up to.
I'm going to unmute Matt just in case he had anything to. Oop, he might have unmuted himself, and now I've muted him again.
No, I'm here.
Oh, Matt or Katie, I have not heard anything about broom mites in this area on sort of the south central coast.
Yeah, nor I.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't either. That might be a Tom Dudley question.
Does the person who asked that question know whether this was something that was intentionally released in El Dorado County to control broom, or whether this is something that has been an issue? Oh, and here's the big question. Well, maybe that person can type in anymore. Will fire increase from climate change in California?
I think that's contextual, but I think in general, in our forests, our middle elevation forests, it'll change. Longer summers, drier end of summer conditions will definitely create more flammable conditions in our forests. Already has. Probably result in the lower ecotones of our conifer forests moving upslope. In the deserts, which are about 25% to a third of the state, the real issue is not so much warming, but changing rainfall patterns. The atmospheric rivers associated with El Nino, that sort of thing, are extremely strongly associated with high fire years in the deserts. So it's the climatic extremes rather than climatic means that are really result in high fire years in the deserts. There's the last I saw, there's predictions of greater highs and lows in precipitations, which basically means that there'll be more potentially big fire years in the deserts. They'll still be very infrequent, but there'll be, for example, 2005, 2006 was kind of a century plus event in terms of precipitation, something like 300% above annual average in Las Vegas. And those sorts of events are predicted to become a little bit more frequent.
Huh. I would say one thing, we have a fire researcher with Cooperative Extension here at UC Santa Barbara, Max Moritz, who focuses a lot on wind, actually. And one of the things that we certainly saw in the Thomas Fire was the duration of the wind event was, I believe they said, unprecedented. It certainly was long. And so that's something to really consider, that there's several factors together. There's changes in precipitation, perhaps increased drought leading to dry seasons, but also increased wetness at the wrong time can produce more fuels. But then that wind piece is really interesting too, because that's what drives the size, not just the frequency, but the size of a lot of our fires in the chaparral, sage scrub, coastal areas of the state.
That's a good point. And in the eastern Mojave, that is on the edge of the monsoon belt, in 2005, the Hackberry Complex, which was 75,000 acres in the Mojave Preserve, was wind-driven for sure, and it was associated with thunderstorm cells associated with the monsoon. This was late June when it happened, and something like 30 to 40 mile per hour fire spread rates were reported in blackbrush and creosote bush, which is extremely high for the desert. And so one of the things that's been shown is that the large fires and fire extent are really associated with the monsoon belt in the Mojave and the Sonoran deserts. And so another aspect is where that monsoon belt may move. If it moves further west into California, there would be more situations where there would be some high winds during the summer, basically. And so that's another factor in terms of desert fire regimes.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Zach Dowell, for writing in more information about the broom mite, which I guess was introduced in Washington and Oregon and is just now starting to spread into the northernmost reaches of California. Doug, maybe that's something CalIPSI can look more into for a future newsletter.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank our speakers, especially Matt and Katie. Thank you so much. Thank you to Greg Ira for coming in as a moderator today from the UC California Naturalist Program. And thanks to all of you for joining this webinar and the whole series. And go out there and attack some invasive weeds this weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
And with that, I'm going to end this webinar. Thanks again.